So first of all, we have to think of what the endocrine system is about. It's all about hormones. So it's made up of a set of endocrine glands, and these glands secrete their products, which are the hormones, into the blood system, into the bloodstream. We have multiple systems involved. So the hypothalamus and pituitary gland control a large number, but not all of these hormones. The hypothalamus receives signals from blood, for example, and from other signals coming into it, and it will regulate the release of hormones from that hypothalamus, which then talk to the pituitary gland and regulate the release of other hormones. We have our thyroid and parathyroid gland. Thyroid hormone is involved in our metabolic rate, and the parathyroid hormone is involved in calcium regulation, and it stimulates the production of active vitamin D in our kidneys, for example. We have the adrenal glands, which release adrenaline and cortisol, so our long-term and our short-term stress hormones, as well as aldosterone. The pancreas, of course, stimulates the release of insulin and glucagon, amongst other things, and the kidney responds to hormones, but also releases EPO, erythropoietin. And then you've got the reproductive glands, such as the testes and the ovaries, releasing testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. And so the whole point of this is that the endocrine system is coordinated with the nervous system to provide an integrated control of homeostasis. Because the hypothalamus is part of our central nervous system, and it's receiving lots and lots of signals, and it talks to the pituitary gland to release hormones from that endocrine gland. And the endocrine system is very different to the exocrine gland or the exocrine system, because that secretes substances onto epithelial surfaces through ducts, such as your saliva, sweat, mammary glands, and your mucus. So they're very different, the endocrine system and the exocrine glands. So first we'll just summarize the nervous system and actually what neurotransmitters do, because the neurotransmitters, as you'll know, they act as local chemicals to transfer information from cell to cell. It's integrated by a network of cell connections, and these neurotransmitters travel over very short distances. And of course, the signal transduction is very, very fast across that synaptic cleft. The endocrine system acts as blood-borne chemicals, and they therefore enter the bloodstream, and they can be very fast, but they can also be very slow. Some just take a couple of milliseconds to kick in, others seconds, minutes, hours, days, and years. The hormones can work at different rates. So which hormones do you know that might act really fast, and which ones do you think may act slower, for example? Press pause. Which ones act fast? Which ones act slower that you already know about? So, of course, the fast ones that you'll hopefully be thinking about in particular would be adrenaline, so part of your fight or flight response. And then the longer ones, if you're thinking about a 28-day cycle, for example, you'd be thinking, estrogen and progesterone. You might be thinking about growth in terms of growth hormone, which is taking place gradually over many years, but also has some acute effects as well. So it raises your blood glucose levels, for example. So overall, there are multiple functions of the endocrine system. They help to regulate your metabolic rate. That's through thyroxine and thyroid gland, released from the thyroid gland. They help to regulate your water and electrolyte balance. So, for example, antidiuretic hormone, which increases water reabsorption through the kidneys. Electrolyte balance, so calcium reabsorption, magnesium reabsorption from the kidneys. You've got sodium and potassium balance. So there are all manner of electrolyte balances going on that are being regulated by hormones. We need to be able to cope with stress and trauma and infection. So we have our short-term stress hormone, which is adrenaline and noradrenaline. So noradrenaline is a hormone released from the adrenal medulla, but it is also a neurotransmitter, of course, as part of the sympathetic nervous system. And it allows our body to cope with infections and trauma. So cortisol, obviously, is immunosuppressive. It's also anti-inflammatory. So it helps to regulate and maintain a suitable environment with regards to inflammation and infection. We have hormones that regulate growth, so you'd be thinking about thyroxines involved in that, but growth hormone is one you'd be particularly thinking about. Also, testosterone is involved in growth, for example. Hormones controlling reproduction, again, testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone in particular. They regulate circulation and red blood cell production. So red blood cell production, for example, your erythropoietin released from the kidneys. And regulating circulation, you might be thinking about adrenaline and cortisol, of course, are both very important. Adrenaline being very vasoactive, cortisol helping to make adrenaline work properly. And Then we got control of digestion and absorption of food. That also uses a number of hormones that we will talk about at a later point when we come to the GI system. So now let's go on to cell-to-cell communication, because the coordination of cell activities and continuation of life requires cells to effectively communicate with one another. And we can do this through lots of different mechanisms. So like we've said, there are neurotransmitters. These are short-range chemical messengers, and you get graded potentials, which will stimulate a nerve cell. That will lead to a graded potential, and therefore potentially an action potential if the signal's strong enough. And that will lead to the release of a neurotransmitter. And the release of that neurotransmitter, that can diffuse across the synapse, bind to a receptor, and therefore stimulate or inhibit that target cell, whether that's a neuron, a muscle, or a gland. And of course, there are lots of neurotransmitters. So noradrenaline is part of the fight or flight response, so the sympathetic nervous system, but also acetylcholine is a major neurotransmitter. And there are lots of others. And some of these neurotransmitters, they can diffuse away, they can get reuptaken into the presynaptic neuron, they can get inactivated or deactivated by local enzymes. There are lots of potential ways that these neurotransmitters can lose their activity. We then have hormones. So these are long-range messengers. So they're released from an endocrine cell. They enter the bloodstream in response to a specific signal, and they can exert their effects on target cells some distance away. So they basically have to enter the bloodstream to exert their effects. And they, just like other chemical messengers, they need to bind to an appropriate receptor. Sometimes that'll be on the cell surface if they're water-soluble hormones, or it might be within the cell itself if they are lipid-soluble hormones, because being lipid-soluble hormones, they can cross the plasma membrane of the cell. We also have neurohormones, and as the name suggests, these are hormones released from a nerve cell or a neuron, so hence a neurohormone. So they are released into the blood by neurosecretory neurons, but again, they're distributed throughout the blood to distant target organs, or target cells rather. So again, you get your action potentials and the release of a neurohormone, so from a nerve cell directly into the blood supply, and then that will go and bind to its target cell. So there are a couple of examples that we'll talk about. So antidiuretic hormone is released from the posterior pituitary, and that is a neurohormone. Likewise, oxytocin is released from the posterior pituitary. It is also a neurohormone. Ditto adrenaline and noradrenaline released from the adrenal medulla. That's a modified part of the sympathetic nervous system, and so they are also neurohormones. We're thinking about antidiuretic hormone, which is the example in this slide. It's released in response to an increase in the plasma osmolarity or a significant drop in blood volume or blood pressure, and it stimulates to reabsorb water from the kidneys. So that was really a brief comparison of the nervous and endocrine systems. So there are a lot of similarities in that they're trying to communicate with other cells and they're helping to regulate homeostasis, but they act in different ways. So now we're going to talk about the different classes of hormones and their mechanisms of action. And again, this is only a summary at this stage. So we have peptide hormones. So as you might expect, peptide hormones are proteins and shorter peptides. They are hydrophilic, so in other words, they're water soluble, and therefore they are transported around the blood, dissolved within the aqueous fluid. They're stored in secretory granules. So here is your endocrine cell up in the top right, and you can see it's stored in secretory granules. And when when a appropriate signal comes in, this granule is released to the cell surface. The hormone's released into the blood, and it can flow through the blood and bind to its receptor. And the majority of our hormones are peptide hormones, examples being insulin and growth hormone. Amine hormones, these are synthesized from a single amino acid, and that's often from tyrosine. An example of this is adrenaline. And again, some of these are hydrophilic, some aren't, some are hydrophobic, but adrenaline is a hydrophilic hormone. So again, it flows in the blood in the aqueous phase. And of course, that also means that it binds to cell surface receptors because it can't diffuse across the lipid plasma membrane. Other amine hormones include thyroid hormone or thyroxine. This is, again, derived from tyrosine, but this is iodinated. And so the iodination of the tyrosine and the general structure of this hormone mean it is lipophilic. So when a fat-soluble hormone is released from the endocrine cell, it enters the blood and it will bind to a transport protein. And it'll be traveled around or passed around the blood, bound to this transport protein. The majority of it will be bound to the transport protein. Small amount will be diffused, will be soluble rather, and there's this equilibrium. And remember, it is only the non-protein bound form that can diffuse through the plasma membrane of a target cell and bind to a receptor, usually within the cell itself, because it diffuses across the plasma membrane, where it can go on to exert its effect. Same thing with steroid hormones. They are also fat-soluble hormones. They also bind to plasma proteins to enable them to be carried around the blood. And the steroid hormones are made from cholesterols. They're cholesterol derivatives. So examples include cortisol, aldosterone, and the sex hormones, which are released from the adrenal cortex. Cortisol and aldosterone, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone are obviously released from the reproductive organs. And vitamin D. That is, again, it's a steroid hormone because it's made from cholesterol. And to make your vitamin D, you need sufficient sunlight. So it starts its life as cholesterol within the skin. You then need it to get further activated in the liver before it's finally activated in the kidneys through the activity, stimulation of a variety of enzymes, which have in themselves been stimulated by parathyroid hormone, which is also involved in calcium regulation or calcium homeostasis. But again, we will cover these at a later time. Just to note that it's only the free form of hormones that are available to tissues and therefore exert their effect. Remember, the stuff that's bound to the proteins, the hormone that's bound to the protein, cannot get across the plasma membrane and bind to the receptor. So what about intracellular signaling? Well, some messengers enter the cell and bind to receptors in the cytoplasm. So an example there would be your steroid hormones. They are lipid soluble. They can diffuse across the plasma membrane and go on to bind to their receptor. And it can then, when it binds to the receptor, it can induce a conformational change. It can also, leading to signal transduction, it can also direct signal responses. So hormone receptor complexes binding to DNA, for example, which can induce changes in gene expression. And thyroxine is an example of a hormone that induces gene expression. So the point of this is that the information is processed without any intermediate steps. And examples, thyroxine, testosterone, and estrogen. Other messengers bind to the cell surface. So these are the water-soluble hormones. And they can induce signal amplification. So they bind again to the receptor. We get then intracellular signaling molecules are produced. And you get this signal amplification process occurring in most cases. And then you get a response, whatever that might be. There are lots of changes that occur. And this will be things such as the majority of your peptide hormones, such as parathyroid hormone. Remember, that's to do with calcium homeostasis. So here are a couple of questions. What I'd like you to do now is press pause, have a look at these questions, see if you can answer them, and we will move on to the next step. So press pause. Okay, so which of the following statements about hormones are correct? They are produced by endocrine glands. Obviously, that is correct. Number 2, they are modified amino acids, peptides, or steroid molecules. That is also correct. They are carried by the circulatory system. That is correct. They are used to communicate between different organisms. That is not correct. Remember, they're not used to communicate between different organisms. Hormones are blood-borne. Number 5, they elicit specific biological responses from target cells. Of course, that is correct. So, second question. Which of the following are functions of the endocrine system? Maintenance of blood sugar levels. That is correct. So there are multiple hormones involved in regulating blood sugar levels. So I just want you to press pause again and have a think. Which hormone or hormones increase blood sugar levels? Which hormone or hormones decrease blood sugar levels? There's only one hormone that decreases blood sugar levels, and that's insulin. And hence why there are issues if we have a lack of insulin or insulin resistance. There are no backup hormones there to help us. However, there are 4 hormones that will increase our blood sugar levels. Again, press pause. What are they? Glucagon, growth hormone, adrenaline, cortisol. So those 4 hormones increase blood sugar levels. So if you have chronically elevated levels in any one of those hormones, you can potentially become diabetic. Number 2, regulation of metabolic activity and water and electrolyte balance. That is correct. Of course, thyroxine regulates your metabolic activity, ADH, your water balance, and there are lots of hormones involved in electrolyte balance. Number 3, promotion of growth and development. Again, that of course is correct. So growth hormone, testosterone, thyroxine, just a few examples. Number 4, direct transduction of external stimuli. That is incorrect, because of course external stimuli are detected by receptors and it's generally neuronal in nature. Number 5, helping the body cope with stressful situations. That is correct. Cortisol, long-term stress hormone, adrenaline, short-term stress hormone.